So Chip, you're joining us here in Graz. So you're working on a project which you're presenting here about how democracy assistance can be compared with missionary work. How did you get the idea of doing this kind of research?
So I did some research on U.S. democracy promotion in the former Yugoslavia, and I published a couple of pieces on that and found some very puzzling things. But as I was reading about democracy promotion, I saw a lot of comparisons to missionary work, but they were just sort of throwaway comparisons, missionary zeal, and they didn't go beyond that. So I thought, well, let me see if I can get something out of that. So I looked around for social science literature on religious missionaries, and there actually is not a lot. There's a lot of stuff by missionaries themselves. There are ethnographies by some anthropologists. And then a friend of mine, an anthropologist, suggested a book by Reppy, who is an American anthropologist who has a book, Christian Moderns, on early 20th century Dutch Calvinist missionaries in Indonesia, Sumba, the island of Sumba. And I read that, and it really worked very nicely. And so I thought, I'm going to use this framework, sort of a conceptual framework of religious missionaries and religious conversion. And so I also read a lot about religious conversion, and then see if, what that helps us understand about democracy promotion. Not so much about democracy promotion in terms of the mechanics of it, but in terms of, the explanations for failure or success that are given by the democracy promoters themselves in terms of their target societies.
So how would you say, is it similar, or what are the differences between missionary work, which mostly, the main wave was a century ago, so to speak, and the main wave of democracy promotion is today? How do you see those?
Well, the first thing I have to say is that missionaries are not all the same, and there's a wide variety of missionary ways of interacting with their populations. And actually, one of the things that got me to think more about this was a talk by a historian of 16th century North America, and he compared the English missionaries in New England to the French missionaries in New France. And he found that the English missionaries in New England believed they had to turn the Indians into Englishmen first before they could become Christian. Whereas the French were willing to build on the existing culture and sort of they wouldn't call it syncretism, but it was similar to that. And it was really striking because I had just looked at a number of U.S. NGOs, and some of them were operating very much in that Protestant way of you have to ignore all of the existing stuff that's not important, it's actually an obstacle before you can become good liberal Democrats. And another NGO, a couple of other NGOs, one of which was Catholic Relief Services, ironically, had a very different view that local knowledge is important and we use locals to help design our projects. And so I said, that's a very interesting parallel there. So that's the first thing I have to say, that missionaries aren't all the same. But I think Keene's work is interesting because he does openly link the Protestant missionary work in the early 20th century to liberalism, because his argument is they're coming from a very similar sense of agency, right? Individuals having agency. For the Calvinists, obviously God has agency, but individuals do, and that's it. And so liberalism obviously is about individual agency. And so that parallel is one that really I thought would be fruitful. Obviously there are differences because religious missionaries, which still exist today, religious missionaries, often for them it's a lifelong calling and it's a sort of a lifelong commitment, whereas for democracy promoters, as you pointed out, it's usually a phase. They're doing something else, they do democracy promotion for a while, and they do something else. On the other hand, I thought the parallels were interesting enough that to pursue it, including in both cases, the secular and the religious missionary, believe they have something good that they're offering others to help them, truly beneficial, and that it's a universally valid truth as well. And so, obviously, religious belief is different than political belief, but I think they're both kinds of worldviews. So I think the parallels are enough that, and I think the comparison is a useful one.
To which degree do you see the linkages also between missionaries and colonial projects and democracy promoters today and post-conflict state building to some degree through some structures which resemble some of the colonial experience in terms of external building of institutions, external setup of constitutions and so on and so forth.
Yeah, well, obviously it's a different phenomenon now, and in the old colonial empires, the missionaries didn't see themselves as instruments of the colonial state. They saw themselves as doing things for religious reasons, and often they did things that the colonial powers were not happy with. So it wasn't as clear cut as they're the soldiers of the empire. And the other thing is methods of control were different then, and if you want to think about there's not really a colonial empire now, but there is if you want to put it in these terms, there's a different way of control, and it doesn't have to be, it's not about physical control. It's about a particular economic model that is seen as universally valid and the only valid way to do it, and that is accompanied with a political system that is also seen as universally valid, which is about limiting state power. And so, if you wanted to draw that kind of parallel, I guess that's how I would do it. I would say the democracy promoters, I don't think the ones that I've spoken to don't see themselves as foot soldiers of the empire at all. They really believe that they're helping the societies they're in. They're very well intentioned. And so I would say some of them are also critical of, say, some of the neoliberal economic policies that come along with, the import of liberalism. So, yeah, there are differences, interesting parallels too.
Implicitly by comparing democracy promotion to missionary work, it's a critique of democracy assistance, or at least it would be easily understood as a way of critically looking at democracy assistance. How do you, do you see it as a critique? Do you see the fact that they're driven by ideals or by even ideology? Is that fundamentally a problem? Because you're also saying, well, this motivates people, right? This is what gets people fired up to, say, go to Bosnia or dangerous places like South Sudan or Afghanistan. How this kind of comparison, what is, in a certain way, what do you see is the outcome of that or the purpose of that in terms of understanding this work?
Well, for me, the motivation was the puzzle. This isn't making sense. Sort of the kinds of projects that were being imported that were based on the assumption that you don't need to know anything about the local society or history or etc., as well as the explanations for failure, sort of, to simplify, blaming the local population for the failures. Those were puzzles to me, and I wanted to try to explain them. I'm not doing, something specifically for policy, but I suppose the policy results would be, well, let's think a little more deeply about reasons for failure, and let's critique the entire project and be self-aware of the fact that what we're pushing is a certain notion of agency, which, realistically doesn't exist anywhere. There's always some gap, but in some cases the gap is so large that people cannot realistically be expected to buy into that, to say, oh yes, let's go vote and that will possibly change things. And I think Bosnia is an example of that. People know that elections are not going to change anything. The people who have agency are external actors and the political parties and the people in the power structures, but they still have a sense of agency because the plenums and the demonstrations we saw earlier this year show that people still have a sense of agency. That is, they believe they can change things, but not through the electoral system, not through the liberal institutions that exist.
So to some degree, it's would you then argue that the French missionary approach, so to speak, what you were giving as an example in Quebec, today's Quebec, is that the approach? I'm not saying that whether they were successful or what, but that's, you're giving it as an example of building on local traditions, and actually that democracy should be a reflection of local needs or local also demands and local patterns. Is that in a certain way then the conclusion to say this is the kind of democracy assistance which is maybe more in tune with needs? Or
well, I think if you're going to build, again, the literature on conversion shows that conversion happens when the old way of making sense doesn't make sense, the old way of understanding reality doesn't make sense anymore, the gap's too large. And there's always an overlap between the old beliefs and the new. There has to be like a hook. And so I think to be effective, you would build on notions of agency and participation that existed in socialist Yugoslavia. And I think what we're seeing with the plenums, my understanding of it, some of that is coming from those older notions of participation, as well as older notions of social justice, and and its reaction to inequality and perceptions of injustice. And so it's not just sort of using local knowledge, it's like sort of going to where people are, drawing on their experiences, and if you want to create a liberal democratic republic, not seeing that this is something we're just going to import and what existed before doesn't matter and it's an obstacle, when in fact I would think it's a prerequisite to have a successful liberal democracy. You would have to build on these pre-existing notions and experiences.
And I guess also what is implicit is that of course liberal democracy will look very different potentially in a place like Bosnia than it would look in the US or elsewhere. I mean, I guess the underpinning argument is that democracy will have its own expression depending on the society it comes from, if it draws on pre-existing traditions, as opposed to saying there's one model and that's the way democracy has to look like, and we're going to impose it everywhere because there's only one way it can look. Right?
Yeah, well, that's not what the democracy promotion NGOs say. Yeah, they don't say that, but part of the story though is economic policy, because if you have a democratic political system but economic policy is off limits, what kind of agency do people have? In the United States, it's not a problem because people think of it in different terms. But I think if you're coming from a place where you had a political system where economic equality at some level and justice and welfare state sort of philosophy existed, and people still have expectations, my understanding looking at polling, it hasn't changed that much. And then to suddenly put in place an electoral system which is like, you control your own fate, but by the way, this stuff's all off limits. I think that's part of what the plenums and the demonstrations were a reaction to. And so that again gets to the gap. So the answer to your question is, it's not just about the political system, it's about beyond that. And so then the question is, to what extent are countries allowed to, what's the allowable range of economic policies that states can have these days? And I think if the gap gets too large, then you're going to have skepticism and possibly a rejection of liberal democracy in favor of other more authoritarian systems. I mean,
Well, this is, I think, a project which has a lot of potential in terms of expanding into many directions, and it's certainly very exciting. And it's good always interesting to draw these parallels across, also diachronic across different periods. So, well, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.